Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. My name is Roy Green. I'm the Dean of the UTS Business School, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here to the new home of our business school, the Dr. Chowchak Ring building, designed by Frank Geary, his first building in the Southern Hemisphere, possibly his last. He is, after all, 86 years old. Before I continue, on behalf of all present, I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal and Gurungai people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that UTS stands. I also pay respect to their elders past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this place. So it's a great delight to see so many friends and colleagues here today for the Digital Innovation Forum. And we're very pleased to be hosting this event with the Minister for Communications, the Hon Malcolm Turnbull, the Parliamentary Secretary for Communications, Paul Fletcher, and members of our distinguished panel, Vivek Kundra from Salesforce, Kate McKenzie from Telstra, Sahil Merchant from McKenzie, David Curran from Westpac. Before proceedings get underway, I just have to do a bit of housekeeping, so please bear with me. In the case of an emergency, please leave the room via the closest exit behind you or here at the front of the room and follow the direction of UTS security. This event is being photographed and recorded. Content may be used in printed publications and online. If you have any concerns about your image being used for these purposes, please speak to an usher. The recording from today will be available from the department's website soon after the event has concluded. The hashtag for the event is #DigitalInnovationAU. So please tweet during the event today and include this hashtag. Towards the end of the event, there is an opportunity for questions from the audience, and we will be using the table microphones that you see in front of you. To ask a question, please press and hold down the small button on the microphone base while you are talking, and you'll see a red light on the microphone to indicate that it's on. So turning to my introduction now to our major speaker, the Minister. It's in the digital economy, it's not about running business as usual. It's about imagining the future. And as we know, the future is difficult to get to. It's very precarious. It means convincing those who fear that they will lose and encouraging and identifying those, perhaps most, who will gain but remain silent because they don't realise it yet. That's Machiavelli, of course. And we have a minister with us who is very adept at making such a case about the future, who engages with the public. And it is, of course, important to remember the words of Jeffrey Garton in this context, the former advisor to President Clinton, who said, "Vision without execution is hallucination." The future vision that Malcolm represents is also represented in microcosm here at UTS in the precinct around us, which is an extraordinary, vibrant precinct of creative digital activity. Some of you may have seen the Startup Muster survey from the ABS indicating that we have 3 times the density of entrepreneurial startups here compared with the next ranked postcode in Australia. And much of this activity is technological, but it also features non-technological innovation around business model transformation, around systems integration, around design thinking. And we've formed a company that will be the network broker together with UTS and Microsoft and PwC, Telstra, many other organisations who contribute to this vision here called Intersection. And the building that we're in exemplifies the ethos of this emerging creative precinct for Australia. We're in the post-mining boom era, and we are looking now for new sources of growth and value creation. And those are sources which will be found in the skills and knowledge of the graduates that we produce here, skills that include boundary crossing skills such as design, thinking, communication, creative problem solving, as well as specialised skills The students that come from here are the students who will shape their own destiny, and they will shape ours. And digital transformation is a very, very important part of it. And with that, I'd like to welcome the Minister to give his opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Roy, and isn't it wonderful to be in this amazing feat of imagination, this extraordinary building here at UTS. My friends, we are in the most exciting time in human history. There has never been a time that is more disruptive, more subversive, more exciting than what we have at the moment. The pace of change is unprecedented, and it is all driven by digital technology. And we have an abundance of technology. There is no shortage of technology. What is often missing, and particularly missing in large organisations, often missing in government, hence the Digital Transformation Office, is the imagination, the attitude, the culture that enables you to think laterally and think creatively and be prepared to say every day the way we did things yesterday may not necessarily be the way we will do them tomorrow. Just as technology is reinventing our world, so we have to reinvent our organisations, reinvent the way we deal with our customers. Now, the critical focus of the Digital Transformation Office is customer centricity. What we need always to do in our work as a government, serving the people, or as our friend Kevin Rudd would say, Wei Renmen Fu'u, serving the people, what we have to do, I suppose there's a few people that can understand my Chinese here, but what we have to do is focus on that customer. You know, for too long, businesses, you know, banks, telcos, big organisations, governments have been focused on themselves. You know, how do we make life easier for us? How do we save costs for us? Instead of saying, as you would do in a competitive commercial business, how can I meet the customer's needs? Because obviously if you don't meet the customer's needs, you're going to be out of business because someone else will meet them. And it's that kind of culture that we want to now imbue the federal government services with right across the board. And the Digital Transformation Office that is already up and running within the Department of Communications, Acting Director David Hazelhurst is there, has been doing an incredible job sitting next to Drew Clark, the Secretary of the Department. What they're doing is focusing on ensuring that citizens who engage with government can do so as seamlessly, as compellingly, as enjoyably even, as they can deal with their bank or with their telco or their online retailer. In other words, to move to that application layer, to move everything you can do with government, of any volume, of any major transactions, should be able to be completed end-to-end digitally by 2017. That's our goal. Now, you know, I'm not promising that we will achieve that. That is certainly our goal. That is our aim. And if we can do it sooner, we'll do it that way too. Now, a lot of this cultural change is often overlooked, or the importance of it is overlooked. The big characteristic, the prevailing characteristic of our times is, as I said earlier, disruption. Or you put it another way, you could say it's uncertainty, it's volatility. And so the question is, how do you make volatility your friend as opposed to your enemy? That's why I hate the term future-proofing, you know, because it suggests that the future is something we've got to protect ourselves against. You know, build a big breakwater or a big wall. What we should be doing is embracing the future, recognising that it's volatile, recognising that there's unpredictability, but of course that's good. Because if you're nimble, if you're agile, if you don't lock yourself into policies that are immutable and keep yourself focused on the customer, or in our case the citizen, then if you are flexible, you can take advantage of all those changes. It might be in technology, it might be in the geopolitical environment, it might be in terms of the way in which cities are operating, because of changes in families or in the changes of how people work. All of those things are moving all the time. But if you are agile, you can take advantage of that. And that's the critical difference. And of course, digital platforms are so easy to adjust, to modify, to amend. We are not locked into a single approach all the time. So that's why I'm so excited about it. Being easily bored, I like to do new things all the time. So the digital age is I find very exciting. Now we're going to talk with the panel a little later about how exciting government is going to be in the digital age. You are going to find, you are laughing. You will be so excited with the Digital Transformation Office, you won't have time to laugh. You will just be quivering with excitement. It'll be like those old evangelist radio programs. And they used to say, "Put your hands on the radio." You're going to be putting your hands on the smartphone and going for the MyGov application, and you're going to be so exciting. What can I do with the government today? What incredibly cool things is the government going to have for me today? And that's going to come from the Digital Transformation Office. And in case you think that'll be more than you can cope with, it won't just be the federal government, because we're going to make these platforms available to all governments, and we're going to make them available free. That was our election commitment, and we did that for a reason, because we want to break down silos, we want to break down all of the inertia that comes from empire building, so that citizens, private citizens or businesses will have a seamless, straightforward way, easy way of dealing with government, federal, state, local, from a single platform. That's the big idea. All of us are very well versed in constitutional law and entirely understand the difference between state and federal responsibilities. By the way, if any of you do, just apply for your PhD in law, constitutional law. But the fact is, citizens just want to get good service from the government. They don't care. They're not very interested in all the different layers of government. And so that's why these platforms should be open to all levels. But anyway, we're the federal government, we're the national government, so we're starting with that. Now, one of my great colleagues and my buddy in communications and technology is Paul Fletcher, the Parliamentary Secretary. I'm going to ask Paul to say a few words to us about this as well.
Well, thank you very much, Malcolm, and it is a pleasure to be here in this magnificent UTS Business School facility. I'm sure everybody in this room who's had the benefit of a graduate education in business studies is like me, feeling that slightly sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, thinking, shouldn't I have read 300 pages of case material last night before I came into this lecture room? But we need to work through that. Look, as Malcolm said, today citizens are used to getting streamlined digital services from their banks, from their insurance companies, from their airlines, and they expect the same thing from government. And one of the points that Malcolm made that I just want to pick up on very briefly is the notion that not all wisdom, shockingly, resides with government, and that there is much that we can usefully, in fact valuably, indeed uniquely draw on from the private sector. Last year, NICTA issued a paper entitled New Models for Digital Government, the Role of Service Brokers in Driving Innovation, which argued that there is big potential in not having government do everything, but finding service brokers who can be the front end of the customer, use those skills in engaging with customers, which the private sector frankly just tends to do a whole lot better than government. Now, I thought that as a story was a very compelling story, and it was even more compelling when I had the chance to meet Ruby O'Rourke, who's the founder of HubCare, which is an example cited in that discussion paper. And their particular angle is providing services to people who have children in a childcare centre. Now, this really resonated with me, having a 6-year-old, having gone through the process of filling out the forms for the childcare rebate, filling out the lengthy and incomprehensible forms and thinking to myself, I'm finding these forms extremely difficult to understand, and I'm sure my experience is not unique. And yet, with what that particular organisation has been able to do is stand in between the government and the end users to deliver a web-based service. And so the notion of drawing on the skills and capabilities of private sector players is something that is absolutely central to what we want to achieve, and that's why it is tremendous to feel, as Malcolm said, the enthusiasm in the room. And so I'm very pleased to be part of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now, one of the commitments of our government is greater transparency and accountability. And so we've asked NICTA to develop for us a dashboard, and this is live, and this is showing you the number of transactions government is doing online, share of all government channels, cost, users, and so forth. And this is the type of transparency which we will build on and evolve over time, so that we are all of us better held accountable. And you can imagine the impact that is going to have as it gets into richer and richer detail. Now, so I want to thank NICTA for that fantastic work. Now, our next speaker is Vivek Kundra. Vivek is an Executive Vice President at Salesforce.com, but prior to that has had many roles in government. And there is a theme today, as you'll see with the rest of the panel, of experience both in the private sector and in government. Vivek's worked in local government, he's worked in state government in the United States, and he was, as you all know, I'm sure, the first Chief Information Officer of the White House. Vivek's going to give us his insights on digital transformation in government, and Vivek, we're honoured to have you address us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that kind introduction, Malcolm. I want to begin by just saying that in Malcolm you have a leader that is transformational. And I've traveled all over the world and have met a lot of people in government, but his passion is unparalleled. And what I love about what he's doing is he's not asking the question about just minimalist, iterative change, how do we go from point A to point B, but he's asking the question, what should government look like in the 21st century? What do we need to build to put citizens at the heart of government operations? What I want to do is take you back to November of 2008 when President Obama was elected. And one of the things that the president did is, for the first time in the history of the United States, he put together a transition team that focused on technology, innovation, and government reform. And that was so important to him because he recognized that in order for the United States as a country to compete in the global economy, it had to recognize that the battle for the future would be won and prosperity would be gained by focusing on technology and how it would transform a nation. And I remember, the first day I walked into the White House, I was handed a stack of documents by my new team who said, "Congratulations, Mr. Kundra, you're now responsible for $80 billion of IT spending for the United States government. And here are $27 billion of technology projects that are hundreds of millions of dollars over budget and years behind schedule." And shortly after that, I remember being in a room very similar to this with bright lights in front of the U.S. Senate, the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, where I was being grilled, and one of the senators said, "Mr. Kundra, what are you going to do differently to manage this money better for the Republic?" And I remember responding, and I said, "Senator, in 60 days, I'm going to launch an IT dashboard where we will take the picture of every CIO in the United States government. Right next to their picture, we're going to put every IT project, how it's doing in terms of cost, in terms of schedule, in terms of performance when they receive the budget, and the names of all the vendors that are working on these technology projects." And you could hear the gasp from my team behind me, and they said, "Vivek, you don't realize nothing in the federal government gets done in 60 days. And I think one of the biggest assets I brought to the job was that I had never worked in the federal government. So I came at it with a beginner's mind. I wasn't locked in, we can't do it because of procurement, you can't do it because of culture, you can't do it because it's never been done before, but it was more about what is true north and how do we get there. Within 6 months of launching that IT dashboard, shining a bright light on government spending, we were able to save over $3 billion. The second thing we did is we focused on cybersecurity, recognizing that it was no longer a threat of kids and teenagers hacking into government systems, but it was about organized crime and nation states, and really focus on moving away from a culture of compliance and treating cybersecurity like you're running a financial organization where you would write these super expensive reports, file them away in cabinets throughout Washington, and those files were far more secure than the very systems they were supposed to protect. We moved away from a culture that was much more about building red teams and blue teams and going after our own systems to really make sure we're addressing vulnerabilities, but we also realized that there was a truth that the government was not going to be able to compete when it comes to salaries and talent. So we had to find the innovative way in terms of how we were deploying technology. So I remember going to Silicon Valley, sitting down with the best entrepreneurs that I could find and venture capitalists and looking at how they were building the future. And one of the things that struck me at that moment was that none of them were going out there and saying, you know what, give me a year and $20 million and I'm going to build out my email system or my ERP system and I need a data center. They were actually focused much more on their customer. They're obsessed with their customer and building solutions for their customers. That is why when you look at the landscape of these companies, such as Netflix, and the killer user experience you have is because they focus on the customer, but their technology runs on top of the Amazon cloud. When you look at what Uber does, it leverages the mobile experience and artificial intelligence. It isn't going out there building massive infrastructure. But the government was stuck in the 1960s, in the era where you had systems of records with databases and ERP systems and supply chain optimization. But the world had moved towards a different system, a system of intelligence. And so that is why we focused on cloud first and mobile first and making sure that every investment we were making was going in that direction. And we shut down 40% of the data centers in the US government because in the last decade, there were 432 data centers. And when the president took over, there were over 2,000. But the utilization of that infrastructure was under 20%. That was $600 billion of IT spending over a decade that was going to a waste. And we recognized what the departments were doing was not focusing on their mission, because the mission of the National Institutes of Health was to advance biomedical discovery and find a cure for cancer, not to build yet another data center. Not to build another data center. And the third big area that we focused on was unleashing the innovation and the entrepreneurial spirit of the American people. So we decided to look at two policy decisions, that had fundamentally changed the course of the world, for that matter. One was just a simple decision to say that GPS was originally used for precision-guided missiles. But what if you could commercialize it? What would happen? Same thing with the Human Genome Project. What if you could make that available for free instead of locking it up in government offices? You started seeing massive innovation in terms of personalized medicine and services all over the world that wouldn't have been possible if that policy decision wasn't made. So we decided to unleash this movement of open data. We started with 45 data sets and have over 400,000 data sets on every aspect of government operations. And what that did is three things. Number one, it enabled entrepreneurs to start building the next billion-dollar companies on top of government data, creating immense economic value. You had entrepreneurs that are building applications on your mobile devices that will let you actually walk into a hospital and see what the mortality rate of that hospital was and whether you should walk in. The rating of the doctor, the outcomes associated, let's say you're getting a knee replacement in that hospital versus other hospitals across the country. Number two, the ability to fight corruption. The American people could go online and see on a real-time basis credit card transactions of public servants and figure out if there was corrupt spending going on or not. Contracts and who was being awarded what contract. A whole host of data that was made available around the healthcare system too. Number three, lowering the cost of government operations, because now all of a sudden agencies wouldn't hide behind just regulations. They could actually share data and build applications that weren't possible before. And the last area that we really focused on was to figure out how do we really engage the public and fundamentally change the default setting of government from one that is normally closed, that is secretive, and that is opaque, to one that is open, transparent, and participatory. Engaging people in the public policy debates and asking for opinions and getting votes in a direct way. And what we found was the level of engagement helped restore trust in government, because people felt vested in their own government. They felt they had a voice that they never had before. And as we look forward, when we talk about this transition from a world of systems of records where billions of dollars of IT spending in the public sector goes to die, to a new world of systems of intelligence, citizens' expectations have been changed. They've been permanently reset by consumer companies. They're used to tapping and swiping on their mobile devices and having a car show up and pick them up. They're used to tapping and swiping on the phone and making a reservation to any restaurant in a city or anywhere in the world and getting a flight. And in the same way, government has to transform. We live in a world today where in your everyday life, there's an app for that. But when you're dealing with the government, there's a form for that. And what we have to be able to do is get to that future faster in terms of the systems of intelligence. And the way to do that is recognizing that the average citizen doesn't care whether it's the central government, the state government, or the local government, as Malcolm said. They want you to demystify the process of engaging with the government, whether you're an entrepreneur who's starting a business, or whether you're the single mother with 2 kids who's looking to get your child to a college and need to apply, for scholarship. It's too complex, and I would argue that it is going to have a massive impact on elections and outcomes, because citizens are not going to stand for a government that doesn't respond to their needs. And this is why the DTO and what the minister is doing is amazing, because it moves Australia to that future faster, and it demystifies how you deal with your government and puts the citizen at the center of those government operations. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Well, thank you, Vivek. That was wonderful and inspiring. Now, our panel, I've already introduced Vivek, and starting down at the end here is David Curran, who is the Westpac Chief Information Officer. There's Vivek, who we've met. Sahil Merchant is at McKenzie now. You are the Senior Vice President and Head of Digital at McKenzie. You've been at McKenzie in the past, and you, like most people at McKenzie, you went off and started your own entrepreneurial businesses. So you've had experience in retail. You've been awarded a prize as Victorian Best New Retailer of the Year in the past. He's got a very good understanding of the centrality of the customer and all of this. And of course, Kate McKenzie is, like Vivek, somebody with experience both in government and in the business world. Kate was head of a big government department here in New South Wales, moved to Telstra, had a number of important positions there, and is now the Chief Operations Officer. And so why don't I start with you, Kate? Telstra has evolved from the Postmaster General's Department. It's the PTT, originally the PTT. And it was notorious for being very conservative, a monopolist, not invented here, blame sort of culture. And you, or David Sodhi, and you and the rest of your senior team have really been shaking that up. How is it possible to change the culture of big organisations so they can be as agile as a startup?
Clearly, I believe the answer is yes, and I wouldn't say we've completed that job, but the organisation now, compared to even 5 years ago, is vastly different, just in terms of the way we think about the world. I think there's a lot of things that you've got to do to make that happen, and you can make assumptions about this. At the end of the day, one of the things that I like about what you said in the opening is you have to have a mission and a purpose that you're very clear about, and I think the journey that we've been on, putting customers at the centre of everything we do, has been at the heart of being able to disrupt ourselves, being able to reinvent ourselves, being much more open and creative in terms of where new ideas are going to come from. Really, a lot of that came from thinking about customers, where they were headed, what we needed to do to stay relevant to the people we were serving. And the more we got into that journey and the more we could see how many points of value we had, the more you start to go, we can't keep doing things like that. And I think, innovation and creativity can come from anybody. I gave out an award to one of my most senior people this week, who's been in the company for 65 years. And that guy is still innovating every day. Now he's got permission, he's teaching the young ones different ways to think about things, they're teaching him things. You've got to create that environment where people have a mission, a purpose, and they're free to be able to create. I think we're all creative at the end of the day.
I think that's right. One of the things that we've got to be careful of when we talk about innovation or creativity, which is another way of describing it, is that we're not just talking about a bunch of kids going off into a garage and coming up with the next Facebook. We're talking about people having an innovative attitude to every business, even the most long-established business, because whether they may not be great leaps of innovation, they might just be tweaks. But it's that mindset, it's that culture of constantly improving that's so important. Sahil, McKenzie, you are the sort of corporate consultant to the universe. Many people have said that just about every financial bubble is caused by brilliant people like yourself, armed with a McKenzie background and a PowerPoint presentation. There's almost no amount of money you can't extract from the financial community for a proposal with those key ingredients. But tell me, what are you seeing, and how? I mean, because you advise governments and companies and so forth. Do you think government is capable of being as agile as the private sector? Is it possible for the federal government, do you think, to be as agile as a bank is in terms of its online engagement? Then I'll ask David what he thinks.
Sure. So I think the answer is yes, but let me put a caveat on that. I think the private sector has a long way to go as well.
Right.
And I should also just say that I try to avoid PowerPoint whenever I possibly can. But I think when we look at the private sector and how the private sector is responding to this challenge, we see a couple of things. And I think this has parallel lessons for government as well. Customer centricity is a nice concept, and it absolutely is key to what we all need to do. But it's very easy to talk the talk and much more difficult to really walk the walk. And what we find is that a lot of large organisations think about this from a point solution perspective. So they look at an interaction with a customer and say, we're going to digitise that. And they see another one there and they say, we're going to digitise that. As opposed to thinking about the end-to-end experience, and I know you use those words in your introduction, Malcolm. And it's very easy to look at those point solutions and say, okay, we have benchmarks, KPIs, and we need to get certain amounts of interactions through an online channel. But still that's taking it from the perspective of the company rather than looking at the customer's experience. And we see a lot of large organisations going half-hearted at this. I'll give you an example. Just last week, I took a cab and I booked it via it was a normal cab rather than via Uber. And I had a wonderful experience in the interface that I used via the app. I booked the cab at 5 o'clock the next morning. I turn up the next morning outside my house at 5 o'clock, there's no cab. It forced me then to go and call the cab company. So the interface that they provided for me was wonderful, but they didn't follow it all the way through the customer journey to allow me to complete that online. And a lot of the research that we have done around the world with government, and this is replicated in the private sector as well, shows that if government is going to be serious about digitising processes and citizen experiences, it has to go the whole way. Interestingly, when you take an end-to-end government journey and digitise it, and then you measure customer satisfaction or net promoter score in this case, it actually turns out to be far higher than if you left it through old channels. However, and this is key, if you go through and only do some touch points and not the whole end-to-end journey, the customer satisfaction scores go well below had you left it alone. Yeah. And I think the key here is that
because you break their hearts. You sort of lead them along and then you dump them. You know?
It's you create an expectation and then you fail it. So I call it full body commitment. If you're going to do it, you're going to have to do it really well. And we're saying in the private sector, there's a lot of examples of half-heartedness, which I don't think works well.
Okay. David, Westpac, Australia's oldest bank.
Yep.
In fact, Australia's oldest company.
Oldest company, yep.
Yeah. And my ancestor John Turnbull was the 13th customer of your bank, I might say. So, the Westpac, or Bank of New South Wales, lent him £25 in 1817, and your new chief executive told me, I hope, in jest, that they couldn't find any record of him having repaid it. So I've never been very good at doing compound interest in my head, but I'm getting truly anxious. Anyway, leaving that aside, David, a bank, you've had big systems of record, huge systems of record, going back for a very long time. I mean, banks were obviously one of the first companies to, introduce computers on a large scale, naturally, given the scale of their operations. So you've got a lot of legacy systems there. A lot of very. How have you been able to manage that system, multiple legacy systems, develop the intelligence that enables you to then have the customer experience that we all have as we engage in our pretty straightforward, satisfying online banking?
Certainly. I think I'd answer that in a couple of ways, Malcolm. Firstly, in the conversation we were talking about there, I might resonate with what you were saying at the start, is the organisation has to have the intent. Yeah. It has to have the intent. Banks worked out a little while ago that you were no longer a product-selling company, you're a customer-servicing company. Yeah. And that transitioned the mindset to putting the customer at the centre of what we do, similar to what you're talking about, citizens at the centre of what you do, but it had to have that change. And that gave people permission to innovate and people permission to do that. We then had to deal with the structures of the problems we've got underneath it, not least of which is our data and the things that are with it. I think one of the things in there is, and it's interesting we're in a Garrick building having this conversation, architecture becomes so important in that conversation. If you actually don't know where your things are and how they work and how you can represent them as services, you just continually go and work around them and create replication of other things and the things you need. Whereas you actually understand where they are, you start leveraging what you've got, providing those as services. And at that point there, you can actually move into the digital age of leveraging what you've got rather than just building new on top of the things you need to do with. It does still leave us, though, with one major challenge, I think, which is still structural. We are, particularly if you look around the room, the generation of people who still like working in hierarchies. And I suspect the government's even more strong in that regard than in the private sector. When you work in hierarchies, you then tend to work in vertical silos and you tend to then reinforce that into your systems. Yeah. Luckily, the new millennials are coming through. They're very happy working in a network manner. They're happy working across the boundaries. And again, that comes back to allowing the permission in your organisation to think across the boundaries rather than just working in your verticals. And that's still a major challenge for us in industry, certainly in banks. But I think that's one of the major challenges to actually get through this concept of actually unlocking what we've got and presenting it to the organisation rather than continually working within the silos and locking it down inside those systems of record.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I think this issue of culture is extremely important. I mean, I didn't see anyone shake their head when I said we've got plenty of technology. The issue is how we use it. And if you've got a hierarchical culture, a blame culture where people manage things up so to avoid taking the risk of making a decision, then you're not going to get any innovation. Vivek, you're working in the private sector, but you've worked at all three levels of government in the United States, which in some respects is even more political than it is here, because so many government positions, what we would call senior public service positions, are in fact appointed by the political party that's won office and then, lose office when their party loses. So it's a more political environment. How do you go about creating that kind of agile, innovative culture in government? Do you think openness has got a big part of this? I mean, you've been a real leader in, as you said, in open data, and just opening up government's data sets so that anyone can, do as they will with them. Build a business, an application, good, bad, or indifferent. How have you been able to change? How do you think that culture is changing? And do you think do you think the millennials, as David suggested, are having an impact in the States as well?
So I think, first is recognizing that government, no matter where you are, is very much like the human body. Whenever there's a change agent introduced, it's seen as a virus and the white blood cells just attack.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of recognize that. And then what you have to be able to do is, when you launch these initiatives, you've got to recognize that most people are not waking up and going to their government jobs and saying, how do I make sure I screw over, the citizens? I think a lot of people have their heart in the right place and want to do a good job, but they may have a completely different view, and frankly, like in most government organizations, they go through so much change, their view is they'll just wait and see what happens. And so I think the key is when we identify the initiatives, and I think at the local government level it's very different because there isn't a political way of addressing particular issues, whether it's picking up garbage or filling potholes or delivering electricity, right? So what you have to be able to do is you've got to be able to, number one, articulate the agenda as you have. Number two, you've got to be able to make sure that you're not only thinking about it in the context of the government, but you bring the customers with you. So a lot of what we would do is essentially town halls with citizens and customers to introduce the government folks to realize, why are we doing this? Make it human in terms of the change that you're trying to drive. So it's not just seen as some loser IT initiative, but put a face to the change that you're trying to drive. So you move the energy away from the internal politics to outside. Who are you really serving? Next, I think what you have to be able to do is you've got to be able to make the tough decisions to literally end a culture of faceless accountability by holding people accountable, because there's an inherent public trust. And if you're acting in the interest of your citizens and there are people getting in the way of that, you need to move them out of the way. And one of the ways to be able to do that is to leapfrog and go to the people who are doing the great work. So part of what we did when we were trying to drive these initiatives is we would tap in and say, who are the hungry people? Who are the ones that have the beginner's mind? Who are the people on the front lines? And literally brought them into the White House and said, hey, how can we help you drive this agenda? And what you will find out is immediately magic starts to happen because the bureaucracy starts to collapse in a way. So all the people that are in the middle kind of guarding and protecting the status quo suddenly start to see, wow, this is the reason we're marching in this direction, and here are the change agents that are going to bring it to life. And so either you become very quickly a value creator or a value destroyer.
What about, Kate, in Telstra? One of the things that I think you've done, which is very interesting, is you've established a couple of incubators, startup incubators. Muru D is the one up in the old telecom OTC building, in fact, in Oxford Street in Paddington, and you have another one as well. And these, while I'm sure you hope that they will come up, they'll sponsor and invest in some startup that will only be worth twice the market capitalisation of Telstra, the prospects of that happening are probably quite low, but nonetheless, you've clearly done it as a means of changing the culture of the organisation. And other companies have done it. Some financial institutions have put money into incubators and startups as a means of trying to permeate the culture of the whole organisation. Some governments have done that. I mean, can you think of a more boring business than the water utility? The Israeli water utility Mekarot has a big technology startup program where they're funding and test bedding startups with technologies that are relevant, with a broad sense of relevance to their area, and it all seems to work. Now, I mean, what do you guys think about that? Do you think this is a meaningful? Do you think government should do more to? I don't just mean by giving grants to startups, but actually trying to encourage more of a startup culture within their own orbit in areas that are relevant to what governments are doing. And taking a piece of the action and getting their own people involved. Is there some merit in that?
I would say there is. I mean, I think you rightly point out, for us, those initiatives, including things like setting up a ventures group and investing in more startups, getting that incubator environment going, it is a big, important part of changing the culture, because people get excited about it, they can see success, they can see that it's okay to experiment, that it's okay to take some risks.
Yeah.
People start.
And it's okay to take a risk that doesn't work out.
Yep, that's absolutely got to be part of it.
That's so important.
And it does sort of then encourage people to think again about, I can take control of my own destiny and think differently about what I do, and I can contribute to these environments, and I can think of, I think you made the point about you need to do it at scale, but you've got to start somewhere too, and there's nothing like some early experiments that are successful to build a bit of momentum around a different way of thinking about the world and making that technology useful for the citizens. You're not going to have a beautiful blueprint that you can see and imagine right up front. You're going to have to do a little bit of let's experiment and see what works. And if you don't change the culture, then I think eventually you run into roadblocks in terms of that momentum continuing to build.
What do you think, Sahil?
I've had an interesting experience in the last 10 years where I've launched, I think now 7 different startups. So I've been in the startup world, and I've also then seen it from the perspective of large organisations. And I think it depends upon how it's incubated. Because you can create a nice startup environment incubator within a large organisation, and in many respects what I now run at McKenzie is very similar. It's a startup mentality within an existing legacy business. But it needs to permeate its way through and not just be seen as isolated. So we talked about before, Kate, you mentioned the risk of failure and permission to fail. In many parts of corporate Australia, however, that still hasn't permeated its way through. And so to me, it's more than just about creating the structures of incubation and saying that that's a nice little thing we have on the side, and if it works, it's great. How it permeates culture is really important. And we're finding that it needs to have some formal mechanisms. And some of those formal mechanisms sound quite trivial in nature, but actually have a major impact in bringing senior executives along for the ride in terms of understanding risk and what it's like to fail, and actually applauding failure, because we don't seem to do that here, compared to, for example, to what happens in the States. And so even things like programs, formal programs like reverse mentoring programs, where you have the more digitally savvy sitting with senior executives and taking them through and getting them familiar with the technology, because it's often fear that stops them from embracing these things. Or getting the senior executives to spend days within the incubation unit or the startup, understanding what stand-up meetings look like, understanding what agile really means, because people talk about it in abstract, but senior executives don't always know what it really means to be agile, and think it's they don't understand it's a mindset as opposed to they think it's an approach as opposed to a mindset. Some of these formal mechanisms are more important than the incubation itself.
Okay, that's the permeation technique. David, what would you have a view on that?
Yeah, Westpac, we've coined the phrase "thinking like a 200-year-old startup." Done that deliberately to create again that permission in the organisation to think that way. If you're not prepared to disrupt yourself in the modern age, you're going to be disrupted.
That is so true.
Decades ago, when you were disrupted, you had time to deal with it. In the digital world we live in at the moment, once you're disrupted, you are on a very slow path.
Because if you're not prepared to cannibalise your legacy business, that's fine. Someone else will do it for you.
Someone will do it for you. Yeah. And so, we have a reinvent your business, similar to what we're talking about with Telstra. Those types of things where we've got to fund and other things, and that's all good and sensible from an investment point of view and learning point of view, but it's also a way to start challenging yourself internally. You know, for example, we've just, through Reinventure, have a stake in a peer-to-peer lending business, which is completely uncomfortable for a bank. Completely uncomfortable for a bank. But it's forcing us in our lending business to challenge ourselves on what that means, because if we don't, and we don't think that way, then our culture will never adjust. So we see it as a decent thing to do in an investment portfolio for all those good reasons, but similarly it's creating that permission within ourselves to think differently so we can disrupt ourselves before we're disrupted and go the way of Kodak's as the example everyone uses.
Yeah, well, there's a few local ones we won't mention for fear of upsetting some people. Now, let's have some questions from the room. Now, I know, is Chris Vane here? Where's Chris? There you are. Now, good, you're over there. Chris is, until very recently, the Chief Innovation Officer of the World Bank, now down in Australia. So, Chris, you had a question, I think. Yeah, press the button, sorry.
Oh. So I guess the question really becomes, how does this get designed? I mean, it does require some architecting to that point. So are you thinking in terms of a common platform that will be built or created or jointly designed, upon which government services will be built, and that will become the intersection point between agencies? I'm just a little...
Yeah, the answer, and Chris, by the way, is your work with DFAT is public now, isn't it? Yeah, I've got phew. I thought I was about to commit a massive breach of national security. But no, Chris, Julie Bishop has established an innovation hub within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and I introduced Chris to Julie and vice versa, and it's fantastic that you're helping us really to identify more innovative ways of delivering that foreign aid, which is a big issue, obviously. Look, the answer is a common platform, yes. If I'll give you an example. Well, clearly the interface, if you like, the customer interface, MyGov, which will become the way of accessing most, if not all, government services, is one. But you take something a little bit further back from the customer, for example, grants administration. Now, just about every department has a grants program of some kind or another, and there should be one grants administration system for the government, and maybe it should be available for all governments, because it's all pretty much the same. The differences are relatively modest, but instead of everybody designing their own mousetrap, have one that is available across the board. And again, this is where you've got to break down the silo mentality so that people understand the object is the customer. The object is delivering the best service to the customer as seamlessly as possible. And of course, if you have a common platform, for example, for grants, people are accessing grants from different departments. So it's actually better for them if they've got a familiar experience, regardless of which department they're dealing with. So perhaps there are some other... Please. Yeah. This is for me.
Yeah. Hold it. Okay.
Yeah.
So with the DTO, there's a tremendous opportunity in Australia to do something innovative, creative, not just within government, but using what we're investing in government externally and taking it internationally.
Yep.
Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think I'm a great believer in being much more global in our approach. I think governments have historically been much less global in their research, in their awareness of policy responses than businesses. I mean, you work for Cisco, it's a global business, you are aware of what all of your competitors are doing and all of your customers are doing in every single market. That's your business. Government's less so, and yet we're all dealing with the same problems, pretty much. There are variances, but they're basically the same. And so we have to be more aware, we have to share more. We've taken a lot of inspiration and help from the government digital services in the UK, which has been very successful. So it has done a much better job for customers and actually saved a lot of money as well. And indeed, I said to Francis Maud, who's the Minister of State that's responsible for that, who sent me a note when he saw that we'd announced the Digital Transformation Office here. He said that was terrific because he'd been helping us with it, as had his people. And I sent him a note. I said, well, Francis, if plagiarism is the sincerest form of flattery, you should be sincerely flattered. And I hope that we will make our code available to others. We will be as open to others as the UK government is to everybody else. And I think it's very important to do that. This should be a very, very open and collaborative business. I don't know whether, Vivek, you're the government person here or ex-government person. What do you think of that approach?
Absolutely, and I think the model of creating an app exchange where you can literally exchange apps, not just internationally but even locally. I had the opportunity to spend some time today with Service New South Wales, and they've done a phenomenal job in terms of creating that 21st century experience that could easily be exchanged with ACT or Victoria or Tokyo or London or Washington, and I think it becomes this race to the top, which is so exciting. And I think what happens is you create value in every city, and people just kind of start building on top of each other's work. And that is a huge opportunity. And I also think the other opportunity is for startups in Australia to be able to go out there, build these applications, because with new models that you have, once you solve the problem for the government in Australia, whether it's at the central, state, or local level, the ability to sell that, to other countries is frictionless. So it's an amazing opportunity to also spur entrepreneurship when you start thinking about a whole host of services that need to be transformed.
Now, I know Pip Marlowe had a question. Where is Pip? What, sorry? There you are. This is Pip Marlowe, Microsoft's Managing Director of Microsoft in Australia.
It's good to know that I had a question. I wasn't sure about that. Thank you for the panel, really interesting dialogue. There's been a lot of talk about culture and what it takes, and in private organisations. I know Kate, David and you have done a great job in Telstra in that regard. But when we look at research, and we see some of the differences that are going on in public sector versus private sector, what can we do to have the public sector actually lead? Do more in innovation, test, try, reward failure. You talked about trying things and actually having a culture where that's rewarded and recognised. What do you see we need to do differently in that regard?
Well, if that's addressed to me, as the Cabinet Minister on the stage, I think that there are moving from a blame culture is incredibly important. I know I've said that a couple of times, but it is very important. There is obviously in politics and hence in the public service, the civil service, the consequences of the environment, the media environment, if you like, has a sort of a gotcha culture that makes people often very reluctant to take risks because they could, something could fail, something could not work. I think it's very important to build an agile attitude into what you do, so that when somebody says to me, if we have a new application that we're releasing, someone says to me, Minister, will you guarantee that this will work and this will be the answer? The response should be, well, all I can tell you is this is the best solution we've got to the problem at the moment, given the information we have. We are going to learn a lot by rolling it out. It's only at a beta stage at this point in time. We're going to learn a lot. We can change it. We can improve it. If it's a complete flop, we'll dump it and do something else. But just build, make sure we keep on emphasising that we are in an uncertain environment, and what you actually need in your leaders, whether they are in business, like Kate and all you guys, or whether you're in government, like me and the many of my departmental officials here, or Paul Fletcher, who's also a humble politician like me. What people expect us to be is to have the agility, the attitude, the judgment, the knowledge to be able to make the right decisions as the circumstances change. But obviously always, people have got to know where you're going, they've got to know what your conviction is, and they've got to know that you're focused on the goal, which is delivering that better outcome for the citizen. So, you see with the National Broadband Network, the way we've been able to reposition that is to say, what is the objective? The objective is not building a particular technology platform. The objective is ensuring that everybody in Australia gets access to very fast broadband as quickly as possible and as affordably as possible. What technologies will you use? We will use whatever technologies get the job done at the time, in the location, for the right price. And that's why that business has gone from being totally locked in to one approach to now having considerable flexibility. And as we've seen, the extraordinary the extraordinary to a lot of people, they are extraordinary. The extraordinary developments in broadband over HFC, the idea that you could have over hybrid fibre coax, 1 gig and higher products, generally available, quite extraordinary. No one would have predicted that. Well, maybe some scientists and engineers would have 10 years ago, but frankly the public would have fainted at the thought of that. So again, you give yourself that flexibility. So hope that answers that question. Now, any other? Please, sir.
Thank you. On the basis that we learn...
Can you say... Yeah, introduce yourself.
Beg your pardon. Martin Hoffman, Deputy Secretary at the Department of Industry and Science. Vivek, on the basis that we learn perhaps even more from our failures than the successes, I'd be fascinated to your take on one of the highest profile problems in government IT, and that was the initial launch, at least, of Obama's healthcare system. And your comments on the lessons from that would be much appreciated.
There are actually a lot of lessons to learn from that. And the President himself has talked a lot about that, right? And one of the biggest lessons, again, comes down to execution. If you looked at what happened with healthcare.gov, it was very much around the agency deciding to focus on the past rather than the future. And what I mean by that is they went out there and bought over 800 servers for identity management and made sure in terms of their design principle that when people came to healthcare.gov, they first had to be authenticated before they could shop for healthcare plans, right? And part of what I've been talking about today is, learn from the best. When you go to Amazon, you don't have to first sign in and give your credit card number before you can shop for, electronics or diapers, right? And so the design was all wrong. They focused on building and owning all the infrastructure. They built everything from a position of fear around security. And then they awarded contracts to incumbents, not because they were the best at what they did, but because they had a PhD in how the government procurement process worked, right? So I think if you look at technology, the history of government IT is littered with high-stakes failures. And a big part of that is recognizing that modern computing platforms has changed and have moved to this notion of a system of intelligence that I've been talking about.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you. Tessa Boyd-Kane from the Australian Council of Social Service, and our organisation is fortunate, Minister, to be funded by your department to develop resources for community sector organisations to engage better with digital business. Terrific program. But one of the things that's helped us identify is the very difficult environment for community organisations to invest in not just the technology but the capacity in terms of people and cultural change around their digital innovation. Highly innovative sector, challenged when it comes to the level of digital engagement that we expect. And I suppose one of the things that I think today's session flags for us are the very clear directions around government and large organisations in this area and the challenges that we face for the small to medium enterprises, whether they're not-for-profit community organisations or indeed SMEs in the corporate world. So interested in your ideas about how government and community organisations can work together to improve that capacity, but also very much interested in the thoughts of the panel around that challenge for what is essentially an economically significant but much more diverse part of our economy.
Well, I'll just be very brief. I think what we need to do is to, as Vivek was intimating earlier, we've got to hear from you and your clients as to how we can make our platforms, our interfaces more accessible, more capable of being used by your constituency. You know, this is the customer feedback. This is a collaborative process. It is a collaborative process between government and citizen. Yeah.
A shot at answering that. If you look at how startup organisations attract really good talent, most people don't get very rich from startups. If you look at across the board.
Is this why you couldn't afford a suit?
That's right. I wore a collar today. This is me dressing up. If you look at what they get attracted to, they get attracted to solving amazing problems. Right? That's what really attracts some people in a lot of the millenniums. And if you think about the types of challenges we give in large organisations or in government, it's not going to attract the most amazing talent if you say, how do we make things incrementally better? Right? But if you think about how do you radically redesign and disrupt, that's what gets people excited. And so I think, and this goes to the previous question from Microsoft as well about culture, right? How do you create that culture in government and large organisations? Government, in some sense, it can't replicate the warehouse environment, the trendy ecosystems that some of the, across the board that you find across all startups. What it can do, though, is create some of the most meaty problems that people want to work on. And when trying to talk about incrementalism versus radical disruption, I like the following analogy, I should say. If you said to somebody from the 1950s and you took them today into the hospital environment and you took them to an emergency room, some bits have changed, right? There are computers and you go to the front desk and they'll take your data and they'll triage you. But if you look at the fundamental experience, it hasn't really changed, right? You still have to go and provide some of the information. That information then gets used in a certain way. What if you told people that we no longer had a front desk? So you took away the constraint or the thing that most people think about in terms of when you go through a hospital environment. All of a sudden you create an opportunity to radically rethink something which has been in existence for so many years. People get attracted to those problems, right? And so I think the answer around culture, yes, you can try to replicate certain things in startup or young organisations have. I mean, the reality is a lot of people don't want to go to Canberra as well, which is a problem.
Sahil, I'm going to have to, this is really going to upset all the Canberra civil servants here. I mean, seriously, they'll be seeking asylum here in Sydney and won't go.
But you do have the meaty problems, and I think that's the key.
Yeah. No, please.
Thanks, Malcolm. Narelle Clark. I'm with the ACAN, the Australian Communications Consumer Action Network, by day, and by night I'm with the Internet Society. So we often think in the Internet Society about the Internet being a platform for permissionless innovation. So I was wondering if the panel could comment on this tension between the need for consumer protection and a good marketplace that means consumers don't get ripped off, they don't lose their data, they don't get done over, shall we say, and the need for an exciting platform for permissionless innovation.
Vivek, what about you? You're there, side by side with the most powerful person in the world.
So I think
you could have sent a cruise missile to deal with inappropriate conduct. You know.
Well, I think when you look at the history of the internet, and especially if you look at the principles of the internet society itself, right, it's very much in alignment in terms of what I believe around an open internet that enables innovation. And when you look at the policy frameworks around the world, one of the things that I really worry about is in the name of privacy and in the name of security, the internet is becoming more and more balkanized. Right? I would argue that it has been the greatest equalizing force that we have ever seen in civilization. But you begin to see, what happened in Egypt. You begin to see what's happening in other parts of the world. And I believe that we need to continue to fight for an open internet and advance it, and not just think of it as a technology platform, but on top of it, the human rights. Right? And what does it mean from a human rights perspective and the role of the internet itself? Because the very technology that has been used to build these next generation services that we're talking about, unfortunately, is also being used to target individuals and dissidents and suppress speech. So I think as a nation, it is critical, and as a civilized society, it is critical for us to continue to advance that.
Yeah, thank you. Please, lady right there in the back.
Yes, hi. My name is Sandy Plunkett. I'm an independent...
Oh, Sandy, I couldn't see you in the dark there. Good. Sandy is a notorious innovator.
Okay, I'll take that as a compliment somewhere there, Malcolm. Thank you.
Yeah.
So listen, we've been talking a lot about the customer, driven experience today, and I'm sure you're all coming from somewhere great, well-intentioned, but I personally have lived with, over the years, in various capacities, from journalism to venture capital to being in a startup, that I've lived that the customer is king, the customer-driven experience, and now it's sort of something else about that. But I think we all know mostly here, most of us experience customer greatness, but in terms of being in touch with the customer, comes from competition. And we haven't actually heard that word being used much here today at all. And in the context, so competition drives a new customer experience. A new competitor gives a customer or a set of customers something completely special that the legacy systems or the existing market does not provide, and that creates a new customer experience and other people respond to that. I think that's great. That's what we want from a market-driven economy. When it comes to government, right, again, well-intentioned to create a digital transformation office, very well-intentioned, but the customer and the competitive framework that drives that service delivery is very, very different. There was also one last point. There was one last thing about, we have to cannibalize our legacy systems. In terms of the delivery systems of a digital transformation office from government, what is the legacy framework that you're willing to cannibalize in that system?
Well, that's really, as Tony Jones would say, that's more of a comment than a question, but I just observed that when you talk about cannibalising, or when I talk about cannibalising your legacy business, what I'm really talking about is the old way of doing things. And now your legacy system might actually be literally a system, a network of computers and associated software and operating systems that are driving them, but it's more often than not a particular business model, a particular way of dealing with the world. Now, one of the most important ways of dealing with the digital world is through social media, and we have some questions on social media. So give us what you think are the best, most entertaining questions from the Twitter sphere or Facebook that we can go out on.
Hi, Malcolm. One of the questions which I'm very partial to because it relates to The Lord of the Rings and I'm a closet fan. How does the vision of one platform to rule them all, states, federal government and local, avoid being crushed by its own ambition?
Oh. Okay, what's the next one?
Okay. What coercive powers will the DTO need if it's going to be truly effective? You need teeth to bite.
Well, just the charm of the Departmental Secretary, Drew Clark, is all you'll need. The interesting thing about the one ring to rule them, was it one ring to rule them all and in the darkness bind them? I'm also a Lord of the Rings fan, but I think the point about the internet as the Uber platform though, is what is so remarkable about it. Yes, it is one platform, but it's accessible, subject to the balkanisation concerns that Vivek talked about. It's accessible by everybody. And of course, it's available on every device. And this is one of the challenges that where everyone is having, that everything is going over the top, whether it is telephony, whether it is video entertainment, everything is going over the top, because that is the way. Getting back to the customer point, Kate, what is the platform on which I can reach all of my potential customers all of the time? That is unquestionably the internet, because that's the ultimate platform.
Without wishing to put words in your mouth, I mean, you're not really talking about coercive powers. You're talking about the viral effect, because the platform works. People want to come to it. They want to design new things that are going to be good for people. You're trying to get that kind of ecosystem effect. You don't really want to have one platform to rule them all and a whole bunch of coercive powers to beat people up. You want people to embrace it, and it's useful and it delivers something, so it sort of grows by itself almost.
Yeah, I think, well, that's exactly right. And I think the argument, particularly, this is the interesting thing with digital platforms and government, and that we know that transacting with citizens digitally is so much cheaper than face-to-face or via letter or by phone. The savings are massive. It's also, citizens prefer it. That's why people aren't queuing up at the bank anymore to write out cheques for cash, to take cash out. They're going to an ATM, or more likely, they're just transferring cash into their account, which they're then using, on their credit card or in other online applications. So they're not, they prefer to deal digitally. So it's really a virtuous circle there. I think the resistance to, for example, having a common grants administration platform is not going to come from citizens. It's not going to come from the Treasurer. It might come from somebody that has developed their own bespoke grants platform in their own department, which is clunking along and costing a fortune. And that is where common sense and charm and so forth will be very persuasive. So we are just about, he said, consulting his iPhone. We're just about at the end. David, why don't you wrap up for us?
I was just going to add a piece, if I could, to Malcolm, that one of the things I've learned in industry that may be relevant to that question is, for a long time, the use of technology has been used by people to make their jobs easier. So we've ended up with solutions that technology is focused on. We've ended up with business processes and catalogues of business processes. In the digital age, we're actually learning that digital is represented by customers and citizens are represented by data and services. So we're moving to architectures for data and enterprise architectures and catalogues of services. And once you get that in a legacy environment, you can start making choices. What do you put on the internet versus what do you hold back for security reasons? What services do you enable that all people can use and consume versus which ones do you want to keep in your space? Which ones do you share across departments? Which ones do you keep internally? And it's that shift from solutions and solution architects and business processes and catalogues of those, how I do my job, to data and services, how do I serve my customers, enables that change in what they're doing. So what we're certainly seeing in the banking sphere is how do we start thinking differently? And I know people are suggesting, we've heard it all before, think about the customer. We're only now working out the customer is represented by data and services, and how do we change to that? And that's a very difficult change to make, but only when you get that ability to see across that space can you make that change.
Yeah, well, I think that commitment, that objective, that customer-focused objective, coupled with imagination and the preparedness to take some risks and to try new things, is going to be the key to the success of the Digital Transformation Office in the government, and indeed the digital transformation in Australia. We should never forget that government writ large is a third of GDP. Every step we take to make government more efficient makes our country more efficient, makes it more productive, makes it more innovative. We would then be leading by example, and the reality is, as we all know, that our future prosperity, indeed our future security, depends on us being smarter, more technologically sophisticated, more adept at navigating and rather than proofing ourselves against the digital future, embracing it and taking advantage of the opportunities that its volatility and unpredictability entails. So, lady and gentlemen, thank you very, very much for being on the panel. Thank you, Roy, for hosting us here at UTS in this wonderful example of creativity. And thank you all for attending, both here in the room and, of course, online. And we're all looking forward to a very exciting digital transformation in government. Thank you.